And joining us now is Harry Litman, a former United States Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, now a Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego, and the executive producer and host of the Talking Feds podcast and legal affairs columnist at the Los Angeles Times, where his latest article is Do Trump's January the 6th Sins of Omission and Commission Make Him Criminally Liable? Welcome to Background Briefing, Harry Litman.
Thanks, Ian. Happy New Year to you and all your listeners.
Well, thank you, and Happy New Year to you, Harry. And we'll see whether in this new year of 2022, it seems as if the House Select Committee investigating January the 6th has a pretty narrow window here. If the Republicans are to take back the House in November, they've got to get things done. My understanding is that there's a lot of criminal referrals into the pipeline, as potentially as much as 36, but there's also, and you've mentioned in your article, the possibility of Trump being one of those, but there's also a certain frustration with the Attorney General Merrick Garland, and perhaps a sense that he's really not prepared to go for the jugular, that somehow he's worried about exacerbating divisions in this country. Do you have any reading on that? It's hard to get a handle on it, but what's your sense of why some of the Democrats on the Select Committee might have that feeling that Garland's going to let them down, or he's not sufficiently aggressive?
Yeah, I certainly don't have a reading in the sense of inside information, but I do have a reading in the sense of having worked pretty closely with Merrick Garland. The first obvious point is they are, as you say, working on different timelines. They've set a limit for themselves of an interim report in the summer and a final one in the fall. They're going to, they have a huge team with 5 different topics. They have intransigent defendants and a big litigation a whole practice that'll be going on, et cetera. So they are very anxious that that somebody go for the jugular, and there are hides to show in short order, and that's not the natural timeline for the Department of Justice. I will say this, he really does operate, a good Department of Justice should, and he really does operate according to rules that do not apply to the rest of Washington, which honestly does leak like a sieve. And from the first inkling of possible criminal charges, you have people talking to the press and letting it be known, not necessarily improperly, but talking about Trump himself. You have Liz Cheney rattling that big saber a few weeks ago. Well, that would be the equivalent of the very beginning of a criminal investigation when there are very strong norms driven by fairness and efficacy to keeping things under wraps. I will say this, and I've said it before, I don't see how you do this investigation, biggest of all time in the department, without working your way up to the potential higher-ups. I don't see how you just stop at the miscreants of the 6th themselves and not look into it. So I believe in that sense there will be people, on the ground sifting through what they have. On the other hand, I think you're right, and the people's anxiety in the committee is accurate, that he starts with sort of prudential and maybe even political and a sort of a small p reasons that he doesn't have, a great appetite for jumping into this sort of prosecution, which, among other things, I think he knows the White House doesn't want. I'm sure he's not taking any orders in that sense, but, he does serve at the pleasure of the president. So he has a combination of institutional and small p political factors that push in the other direction, but don't push all the way, in my view, to just letting it languish and ignoring it. And that seems to be the sort of grumbling, or not so grumbling, the screaming that you're hearing from some people on the Hill.
Right. And again, I'm speaking with Harry Litman, a former United States Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, who's now a professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, and the executive producer and host of the Talking Feds podcast, and a legal affairs columnist at the Los Angeles Times, where his latest article is, Do Trump's January the 6th Sins of Omission and Commission Make Him Criminally Liable? Well, clearly, though, this insurgency that took place almost a year ago, we're within 4 days of the first anniversary, and Trump's going to hold a press conference down at Mar-a-Lago, which God knows what's going to happen there.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that this wasn't something that was spontaneous and led by these ragtag militias like the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and the anti-Semites and the lowlifes and the guy with the horns. There was planning involved, and the more that you hear about what they're learning in the Select Committee, all fingers seem to be pointing at Steve Bannon, who is a strategist. And there's not just some strategy behind January the 6th, there's been a subsequent strategy to make sure the next coup is successful. They've really surgically targeted all of the weak spots in what happened on January the 6th. So the first thing that comes to my mind, Harry, is that on January the 5th, Bannon on his Breitbart program said all hell is going to break loose tomorrow and strap in. Throughout that day, he had been in communication with Trump, who was in the White House with Jeffrey Clark, and they tried to, along with John Eastman, tried to offer their plan to Mike Pence. He'd refused it. So the point is, if Bannon knew that all hell was going to break loose the following day, and he'd been in communication with Trump the day before, surely Trump knew that all hell was going to break loose.
Let me start at the point you made in the middle of this. There is no way that it happens as some kind of spontaneous, foot soldiers storming the ramparts. For one, it costs a lot of money, and the more we learn, the more we know that it was financed by known sort of conservative forces. I myself am not ready to credit everything Steve Bannon says about Steve Bannon's role, which, this week a book from Peter Navarro came out that had them as the actual masterminds. He both loves that outlaw image and is self-aggrandizing. But I totally agree with you that there were people in Washington who had a strong inkling that it might be coming, and others up to Trump who wanted it to come. Now, all of that is very much the business of Congress. It's a scandal that Bannon and others, tout these political slogans and are provocateurs on TV, but actually won't give the information and as a matter of sworn testimony. Congress does have an imperative to find out what happened. It is a separate question whether the different conduct goes, speaks to criminal liability. That's what my article was about this week. A lot of people had been writing, well, he's just standing around for 3 hours, and in criminal law, you need a commission, not an omission. That's just a mistake. When somebody like Trump puts things into motion or just has a duty under law, you then doing nothing is doing something, as it was here, right? I mean, we know that those 3 hours, the reason everyone is screaming at him to call off the dogs is because he has the power to, and he's exhorting them to go forward. They think they're there for him, and they not hearing a whistle. They continue to go out of bounds. So I just wanted to I agree 100% with what you're saying, except as it doubles back to Garland and the DOJ. I'm not sure if you were saying that. It's just a different matter, building a criminal case. I'll say this, however, the first criminal referral, that they made with Bannon, it was meaningful that Congress was the victim. And we heard that again and again. The DOJ would consider it. There would be other referrals they could make that they're just saying, here's some evidence, and DOJ would say, thanks very much, we'll evaluate it as we normally would. Of course, as a practical matter, a criminal referral from Congress puts some pressure on. But if Congress is actually coming out and saying, here are the facts we found out about Donald Trump, and he victimized us and caused $1.5 million of damage to the Capitol and made us all cower under our seats, they've got a stronger responsibility to really take a hard look. And one final thing is, everything I've felt to date about his native reticence was most clear with respect. This was coming up even before January, with the Mueller report, and a whole list of arguable crimes from Trump himself and the administration that I think someone could have taken as a closed book taking office. This fresh and huge and still gaping, bleeding assault of January 6th, you can't say that about. That remains. The system as a whole, the country has not made its response to that. And of course, you're right that in this jujitsu way that he seems to do very well, however feckless he is generally, Trump and his team are kind of trying to turn this 180 degrees into an actual first article, and there isn't a second article, on their political platform for 2022 and 2024. It's mind-boggling and infuriating, and we're living through it.
Right, and there doesn't seem to be any way to stop this juggernaut of voter suppression. That
there's a way, but
it's all based on
not a will.
Pardon?
There's a way, but not a will. Yeah,
right, there's a way, yeah, but not a will. And it's so comprehensive that it could lead to a one-party state, a permanent one. So the issue at stake here is the very survival of American democracy itself. But in terms of Bannon, the fact that the Select Committee held him in criminal contempt, they're not going to get any testimony from him, right?
100%. So, and that was always the point there, that people who were looking closely at the process, I'll scratch my own back on this, wanted to make. The one thing about him is he is, as you say, a garrulous guy. And there's a lot of evidence from him that they were going to have anyway. But it was a big cost. They wanted to, I think, lay down a marker for the other people, but they were losing his evidence. And the same is true, by the way, and more serious and more costly to report of Mark Meadows. If you go that other route, maybe at the end of the day they end up in the pokey, maybe not. I do think this. It's a big, professional, thorough team that is really focused on all it has to do by certainly the midterms, when we've just done a pair of end of year episodes, one on the Republicans and one on the Democrats at Talking Feds. And, the odds seem strong among the political brand and punditry that the Republicans will win in 2022. So you certainly can't assume otherwise. So they've got to do it all and hope that it has political purchase by September, October. It's a very daunting task.
And it looks as if Meadows, I don't know what happened in his change of mind there, where he provided documents and then refused to show up after agreeing to show up. It almost suggests that he thinks that the committee's a kind of paper tiger.
Maybe, although it's very interesting. He has sophisticated counsel that he would switch. The big thing for me, and this has come with, there are 10 of these, they got totally afraid once they found out about the third-party subpoenas on phone records. Meadows has this phone that he literally dumps from January 6th, and I think possibly thinks is safe. And when they subpoenaed the third party is when he came in, stopped cooperating, sued in the district court, said he'd been blindsided. Man, do I hope the committee gets those records. Wow. And of course, that's just the metadata, but sure. But it'll be a record of who he talked to and when he talked to them, et cetera.
Right, and the pleas from the Fox News hosts to Meadows to get to Trump to stop the rioting, when Trump apparently was enjoying it, at least, as you point out in your article, at least he said to Kevin McCarthy that his people seem to care more about what's happening than McCarthy does.
What a sick man, right? But yeah, he was jubilant. Yep.
Exactly. So, but just in the last couple of minutes, let's focus on what you're saying here in terms of your LA Times article, that do Trump's January 6 sins of omission and commission make him criminally liable? You make the point that criminal law punishes people for action rather than inaction. But in terms of this action versus inaction distinction, there are examples that you give. For example, a lifeguard can't just sit back and watch somebody drown, or a father can't simply refuse to pay child support. So let's talk a little bit about how that applies to Trump.
Sure. I mean, there are sort of three main ways. If you have a duty, then this is just, law school stuff, omission versus commission, and that general rule that you have to act gives ground. If there's a duty, and, the guy is uniquely in the country, the one who took care that federal law be enforced, or if you put into motion some dangerous chain of events, even if you were innocent, if you hit somebody innocently, for example, you can't just run away. Those are two big ways that the omission-commission distinction that people keep pointing to really cut the other direction here. Finally, though, to me, there is, if I with the limited knowledge we have, we're trying to say what's the best, most fitting charge for Trump's conduct as we know it, it's to have aided and abetted the impeding of the congressional of the official proceeding. That sounds like legal gobbledygook. So just a couple quick points. Aiding and abetting, which is what it sounds like, is in federal law the exact same thing in culpability as if you pulled the trigger yourself. So it's not like a criminal liability light. So aiding and abetting is to be a full principal. So if he encouraged them, this would be the standard under the law. If he encouraged them to go riot and wanting the proceeding to be impeded, he's liable under a statute called 1512. He encouraged with the right mental state, and so that would be a matter of proving. In fact, he wanted to delay the proceedings. I think that's a layup. So that also would be the aiding and abetting principle is another way that this, standing silent for 3 hours not only doesn't help him, it hurts him because in effect, what he was doing for those 3 hours was encouraging them to go forward, declining to call it off. And they thought they had his and did have his sort of imprimatur.
Well, that's where I'm a little suspicious. How did the rioters know that Pence had refused Jeff Clark's and John Eastman's plan, that Pence didn't want to go along with it, and that the rioters somehow knew about that because they were shouting, "Hang Mike Pence"? They also built a gallows in his honor. And when they were actually in the Senate, rifling through the senators' desks, there's video of some of them talking about, they're looking to find out how the senators were going to vote, get hold of their ballots to certify Biden's victory. They said, "Oh no," I think it was them. I think they were actually at Ted Cruz's desk, and they said, "Oh no, he's one of us." So
well, look, one way this was the only way to go, and Trump had said again and again, if Pence has the courage, et cetera. So I don't think there had to be a meeting of 1,000 co-conspirators for them to be on to that idea. That was the only hope. And it was, even we forget now that, how astonishingly unlawful and anti-constitutional it was. So that blunt word had spread, seems to me understandable enough.
Right. But just in closing, though,
Yep.
The Constitution does have the take care clause, which instructs the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I'm not
He's got a duty.
sure. I don't know how he's going to get around that one.
Well, there's again, as always here, there's the verdict of history, and then there's the verdict of the Department of Justice, whether to bring a prosecution. And, those two are very different. But I'll close by, I guess, where I started by saying, just don't, people are too quick to assume that the DOJ will ignore it. I wouldn't bet that on a prosecution, but I'm confident that they'll give it a harder look than many of the critics seem to be anticipating.
Well, Harry Litman, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Always a pleasure. And again, Happy New Year to you.
Same to you, Harry. And again, I've been speaking with Harry Litman, who's a former United States Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, who's now a professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, and the executive producer and host of the Talking Feds podcast, and a legal affairs columnist at the Los Angeles Times, where his latest article is, Do Trump's January the 6th Sins of Omission and Commission Make Him Criminally Liable? We can take a brief station break and back looking into the guilty verdict against Ghislaine Maxwell and a ruling expected on Tuesday